Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. This is a webinar organized by the European Wildlife Disease Association. A few years ago, we set up a sustainability committee, and one of the activities of this committee is to organize webinars that focus on supporting the transition to a sustainable society. And today, we're really happy to have Chris Walzer by us. Chris is an executive director of the health of the Wildlife Conservation Society, also a professor of conservation medicine at the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna. He's got international expertise in studying health issues at the human livestock wildlife interface, and he's going to give a talk entitled Making Peace with Nature, a role for wildlife health to bring society within planetary boundaries. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Thijs, for first of all, for the invitation and for the kind introduction. I'm going to, and welcome to everyone. I've had a quick look at the participant, many friends and colleagues on there. Good to see you all joining us. I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get on with it. So I assume you can see that, is that correct? Can someone just confirm you're seeing?
Yes, your slides are correct, please.
All right, thanks very much. So the title is a bit of a mouthful, and obviously a bit of a challenge. Making peace with nature is is not an easy lift, as you've probably seen in many of these webinars that you've already joined previously. I'm going to, first of all, just give you a little bit of a background. I'm a veterinarian by training. I've gone through many different phases in my career, starting out in practice, and then working in the zoo environment, and then more and more in the wildlife area. And probably some of you on here have heard of me talking about Central Asia. I spent a significant amount of time in Central Asia working with equids. Went to academia, back to Vienna, and from there transitioned to the East Coast of the United States to the Wildlife Conservation Society, where I now head the global health program. So I always like to start with this. I work for a large conservation organization. As you can see, we work across the globe. And when I say work across the globe, these are the places we have offices, right, and country programs. So generally we have some 4,500 employees in nearly 60 countries around the world. That means that's where we have our offices and infrastructure and so on in place. We work a lot with local communities and indigenous community partners. And we're a science-driven organization, so I'll come back to that repeatedly. Now, one of the things about WCS is that when I started, everyone at WCS would go, "Oh, we got boots on the ground." And honestly, I always thought, God, that's a bit corny. Boots on the ground. Now that I've been working in this area for over 7 years, or basically 7 years, I'm like, I appreciate this aspect a lot more, because in contrast or just indifferent to some other organizations, because we have our offices and our staff, and most of our staff, 90% of our staff are national staff, actually are on the ground and have eyes in the field, which really makes quite a difference when it comes to implementing health projects, or basically we talk a lot about conservation today. So as I said, we're rooted in science. WCS puts out some 400 to 450 peer-reviewed publications every year. The amazing thing about conservation organizations like ours, and many others I'm sure as well, is that we work across disciplines. That's pretty obvious. We're multidisciplinary inherently, but we also work across sectors. That's something I definitely didn't appreciate enough in my academic role. Interestingly enough, WCS is also a One Health founder. It's just 20 years this year that Billy Carish, Bob Cook, and Steve Osofsky and others drafted the Manhattan Principles back in the day, which was really the first framing of a One Health approach. It was heavily focused towards infectious diseases. Climate change did not occur at the time, but that was sort of the first formulation of some kind of systems-based approach that incorporates wildlife into a sort of a public health framing. So obviously we leverage the global conservation aspect when we address health, and we mostly work at that interface of environment and health. That's sort of our focus. I'm just going to hop on this. So as a background, I mean, this is a bit silly probably in a webinar where you're already talking about sustainability, but I like to bring this up, but this is the context in which we work and the context that I work in and my team also works in, right? Definitely climate emergency, number one by, I wouldn't say, order of magnitude at the moment. Biodiversity loss, of course, the health crisis, especially since the last pandemic, that has really shifted the ground and shifted the windows of opportunity. But as we'll get to a few other things as well. Then global inequities. And that was the slide I used to have, basically those four. And I sort of thought, well, most people say you can do three, but four global inequities are a massive aspect of our work. But the fifth one, and I will remind you of this one again, is the mis and disinformation. This is becoming, as far as I'm concerned, one of our largest concerns and threats out there at the moment. But we can get back to that again. I'm going to just provide you. So, what does a conservation organization do, and why do they do it, and what do they think? So, we have a theory of change, and I'm going to share this theory of change with you. And this is not a final theory of change. This is not everything in here has been worked out yet. But I'd like you to see why and how we think conservation and health in that aspect can work. Basically, making this, the big making peace with nature approach. So at the moment, nature obviously is in decline. You know that human population, past the 8 billion people. So that's in my lifetime is more than doubled, right? That's also one thing to remember when you think about how fast. But what's one of the most important things? It's not only the number of people that have increased; it's actually the consumption that has increased massively, right? We, 4x. If you look at used GDP in the same time frame, last 50 years, I think 4 times increase, a quadrupling of the GDP, and that's all through conversion of natural capital into economic capital. And so we are at a peak environmental impact at the moment. The idea is that, as I point out, the capital has increased, but natural capital has declined. And I'm not, unfortunately, I don't know if you've already all heard this. Please speak up and tell me, oh, we've heard all this, stop repeating it. just let me know. And this decline in nature and natural capital is this conversion into economic capital as the global economy keeps growing. Now, there are some things, though, that we really need to be cognizant of, and this is really significant in our theory of change. And one of them is we do need to be pretty clear that population growth is slowing down, and in the global north, basically declining rapidly. So there are these projections that by 2100, there will be population will stabilize at 8 to 10 billion people, of course. And that's pretty robust. That's pretty robust. And I'm sure you've seen this in the news and so on. So this is one thing, population growth decline. The global south, especially, and finally, only sub-Saharan Africa will be having massive population growth moving forwards. Poverty has decreased. The world is better in that sense if you use some of these metrics. So if you use a global poverty index, which is a composite, poverty is declining and is set to decline further over the next decades. And then the third point, which is sort of central to our theory of change, is that there will be massive urbanization. There is already about 50% of individuals on this planet live in cities, and it's projected to be up in the 70% and more as we move forwards in the next few decades. So you can think of a child that's born today, could be living in a world with a stable or declining human population, should be out of extreme poverty, probably will live in an urban city, will be fed and have food security with a fraction of the Earth's surface we use today, and hopefully have a shared environmental ethic. Now that's all nice and good, but as we know, that's not going to happen on its own, right? So this is sort of the background on which we're working, and also the health program works. This is sort of our background. Now, in order to address health, we use a systems-based approach to health, and keeping this at its super simplest level. So we're just looking at the structure and function of how interrelated systems operate and interact with each other, right? Sounds really good. Makes sense probably to all of us on this call here. But the reality is that we don't actually really know and understand how these systems work, and often don't have the resources to actually find out how the systems are working with each other. But by the way, I also want to point out, I can't see any chat, I can't see any hands, I can't see anything. So you have to speak up if you want to stop me babbling on. All right, so these systems, obviously, as many of you know, are inherently entangled, and disentangling them is not simple, right? And this, by the way, is not a fake, this little thing I put up here. This is actually the output from a workshop, which was just looking at information sharing. So it's on wildlife diseases, so you can imagine. So for years, teaching at the university, I used this Venn diagram. I'm kind of embarrassed about that now. And I did see that there were one or two on the call here who had to go through conservation medicine with me at Vienna, and I'm sure I used something like this and said, well, here we have human health, animal health, environmental health, and then some magic happens in the middle, and that's called One Health. Now we'll go to the next slide, right? So got away with that for many years. And it's only, in the last decade or so that I would say that we've really started thinking about what actually is going on and how do these various silos basically interact with each other. So we spend a lot of time thinking about this. One of the ways to look at it is this one. I'm sure you've seen this as well, putting the health of all in a sort of holistic, single silo, so to say, or single package. Doesn't really help you. So I spend a lot of time with policymakers and government agencies and similar. And that doesn't really work for them. I normally get pushback quite quickly. Well, that is all. What are we supposed to do? It's too much. So one of the things I've worked on recently with my colleague Craig Stevens has been looking at taking a common public health continuum of care. And if you look at this, I'm sure you've seen this. This is more or less a generic continuum of care here. when I was born, there were no seatbelts and people were smoking. There were certainly no helmets when you were skiing or anything like that, right? So in the last, 5 decades or whatever, that continuum of care has expanded towards the left. And so what we're sort of advocating and trying to get across is, instead of using Venn diagrams and all these circles and all the rest of it, is just to say, let's expand the continuum of care and have nature and climate and the functions there as sort of foundational for that continuum of care. I sort of found that that works better with some agencies and some governments. But I think so still a long way to go. And this is sort of the first try. And I just want to put it out there because we have possibilities to discuss this subsequently. Now, one of the things for the health program, and one of our approaches, is this idea of that the environment, that the intact environment, that means it's also maintains all its functions, is foundational for the health of all. And if you sort of look at SDGs, if you looked at your SDG map, you normally see all these SDGs next to each other, right? But there is another way of looking at them, and that would be to have the environmental SDGs at the bottom, and that they are foundational for all other SDGs, all other goals that we have. And the idea being that if you stress the landscape, and this is from Raina Plowright and colleagues, they've been using this idea of the allostatic load of the landscape. And that's, using that term in this thing is quite controversial for many. I quite like it. It's quite easy for me to sort of grasp that. So that's sort of the theory behind what we're trying to get across when we talk to our colleagues within the organization or outside the organization. Saying that protecting this landscape and conserving the integrity of the landscape and its function is necessary, so you have that buffer, as you can see on the left, as make more resilient landscapes as the environment is changing, as it's getting warmer, as there's more flooding, and so on and so forth. You can imagine that, but I don't have to go and explain that too much. As we know, there's endless amount of stress on the landscape. I'm not going to be able to tackle even a small portion of those today, just because I'm not talking about something really doesn't imply that it's not important, right? So omission doesn't mean it's not important, it's just a question of time today. If you use this, and this building on the same or a similar paper from Raina Plowright, is that there are different parts of the landscape in which you can have interventions which will help maintain that landscape and the wildlife therein. I'm not going to jump into this in any detail, but as you can see, preventing loss and fragmentation of natural habitats would be one. Managing livestock to minimize interactions with bats would be sort of in that interface area. And then in the urban area, reducing or creating safe, living safely with bats and so on and so forth. I think you get the idea. In the center of everything, you have this nature, and this foundational importance of nature for our health. And that's with climate change and the climate emergency, that has really sort of shifted. The circles would not be, as far as I'm concerned, are not equal in size or in importance at the moment. Oops. The other thing to consider when this is just a intact landscape, is that within these landscapes there are many peoples that live, either indigenous or local communities, that live within these landscapes and that are utterly dependent on the resources of that landscape for food security, cultural needs, and so on and so forth, right? So that's something also that we as wildlife health professionals really need to keep in mind every time we start working on and with or in landscapes with wildlife. And basically, this was a long way of saying what the editors at The Lancet put together so well in January of last year. And that is that the implication of a One Health approach, and that can be really any holistic systems-based approach, is that the need to reduce human pressure on the environment is an important medical intervention in itself. And a lot of my work right now is focused on getting across that protecting nature, restoring nature, can be and should be seen as a medical intervention in itself. As you can imagine, not always easy. So I'm going to sort of shift a little bit to what are we doing? And these are just examples of what we as wildlife health professionals can do, but it's definitely only a small, small fragment of all the different things we could do. So the last years, I don't have to tell anyone that it's been dominated by infectious diseases, and it's not relenting. That's really clear. But there's a lot more to health. So I use this slide mostly internally, just to make sure that my colleagues understand that One Health is not about coronaviruses or mpox or avian influenza, and that there's a lot more to it. So I'm not going to be talking much about AMR at all today, but antimicrobial resistance and the environmental component of antimicrobial resistance is really sort of being rediscovered or being first discovered at the moment. There's more and more meetings and more recognition of the importance of that environmental component for antimicrobial resistance. Interactions with the nano and microplastics pollution and antimicrobial resistance. I think I saw Alex Greenwood on here, and he can certainly talk more about that later in the discussion. But that's another really big chunk of work that we as health professionals are obviously and should be involved in. Then ecotoxicology and pollution. I have to say, for lack of resources, we're really remiss in addressing some of these issues. We work quite a lot on mercury pollution from mining. I'll come to that. But we haven't even started addressing many of the other pollutants, the forever chemicals, micro and nanoplastics, air pollution, and so on. And then finally, of course, heat, not finally, but as on my little list here, heat, as it relates to, coral reef habitats, seawater warming, but also for human health. This is from this morning, for those of you who saw this probably in the BBC, probably everywhere else as well. I mean, the temperatures the individuals and communities have to experience now in the Middle East and Pakistan and parts of India is just extraordinary, and it's incompatible with life, more or less, right? And of course, it's always the most disenfranchised which are suffering the most. As I was saying, effects on wildlife from pollution is something we address only in very small segments. We're doing quite a lot on watersheds now and fish and communities that live along there, but it's minimal, right? From the hundreds of different pollutants that we find in these rivers, we can address that, a small handful at the best, and even that's limited. Small scale gold mining, artisanal and small scale mining, that's a big issue across practically everywhere. If you look at the map of where we work and where the highest mercury concentrations are found and the highest mercury methylation opportunities exist, then that's basically where we work. And this is a huge problem for wildlife on one hand, but much more on a much larger scale, of course, for the communities that live in the areas we work in and around those areas. We talk about mercury levels in individuals which are 10 to 20 times higher than what is seen as an acceptable, I think is 1 ppm, which is the sort of WHO line. So what do we do at the health program? I'm going to now dive in a little bit on what we do, just to show you some examples of what we work. So we keep this quite simple. Behind this is a strategy document, of course, like everywhere, it's a strategy document, which we keep changing and adding things to. Honestly, I was someone who's very adverse to strategy documents. Most of you, some of you who know me will understand why. I've always been very curious about all kinds of things and always felt strategy documents and strategies sort of hem me in a little bit. And they do, and it's right, they do, honestly. So behind this, there's a strategy, and this is sort of my simplified way of what we do. So when I talk about one thing we do is we always work on interfaces, basically. These are so to say the edges of destruction on which we work. And it's the health team, of course, but all the more our colleagues from the conservation team, the ecologists, the biologists, anthropologists, social scientists, and so on and so forth, right? This is a lot of our work. As you may know, I've spent a lot of time in the last years working at this interface, this spillover of zoonotic origin pathogens. That sort of comes from the fact that we've more than 20 years now, 25 years, been working on wildlife trade and spillover in potential spillover zoonotic pathogens in some parts of the Republic of Congo and other places. So generally, you all know this, of course, because you're all wildlife professionals. But in a forest, hundreds of thousands of viruses circulate, mutate, evolve, are shared, and so on. Right? And that's really not much of a bother for us. But when we put in the infrastructure, and you put in a road here, so the Ministry of Transportation is fantastic. Here we have a new road which leads from A to B and will allow goods to be transported and will allow the development down this road and so on and so on. We'll bring some schools and it's all good. But if you look at that, of course, that's hundreds of kilometers of a novel interface that didn't exist previously. The more infrastructure you put in there, the more opportunities you're providing for pathogens to spill over into livestock and humans, of course. And that's something we're seeing on a scale which I think is unprecedented. The last decade and a half, the amount of infrastructure being put into forests, into last remaining intact landscapes is incredible. And the new I always say the new frontier, up to now, it's been sort of like a white spot. We don't see much happening in Latin America, but that has taken off now. And the scale of this development is massive. So, once it's out there, it's everywhere, that. And all of us have had to experience that as well, of course. So it's important to always differentiate, and I make it I'm really pedantic about this when I talk to policymakers. So that's a hazard in the forest. Doesn't really bother us. That's that ladder you have in the shed. It's potential hazard, but if you leave it in the shed, it's probably going to be okay. But all these things that we do, land use change in the broadest sense, deforestation, obviously the climate emergency, unsustainable harvesting, legal, illegal wildlife trade, all the rest of it, resource extraction. Those are the activities that constitute the risk for spillover, but those also are the same drivers for climate change, biodiversity loss, inequities. And so that's one of the things to think of when you're working on infectious disease. Let's just pretend you're working on infectious disease and you're focused on spillover, trying to elucidate spillover mechanisms, define interphases, and so on. Then you're also actually working on the same mechanisms that drive climate change and biodiversity loss and inequities. One thing I also, and it doesn't, I use these two papers, and it's more of an illustrative fact here. We use the word spillover in the singular all the time. Wherever you read it, you'll see singulars. Spillover is a constant process. It's like rain, right? This spillover is happening all the time. Thankfully, it doesn't always lead to cell entry, reproduction, and transmission, right? So, but it's important to understand that it's like one of those, how do you say, these games you play with in a casino, right? If you play long enough, you probably will win, right? And if you have enough opportunities. So that's something just to consider. This is a constant process. The interphases, of course, with destruction and incursion of human populations and their livestock into the forest are the areas, of course, we're particularly concerned about. Goes both ways. That's another thing we mustn't forget. If we're talking about from a wildlife health perspective, we can't ignore human health, right? That you can't do that. You shouldn't, and you can't. You're not going to get anywhere. But it is important to point out that this goes both ways, all right? So we and others, of course, a lot of work on various livestock diseases spilling back or spilling over from livestock into wildlife. And those are the peste rumina, for example. I'm sure you all heard of that devastating effect on mountain ungulates across Central Asia, the Middle East. African swine fever impacting the wild boar, which is not so a conservation concern, but has reached Southeast Asia, where it has also impacted bearded pig population. But also think of it as a prey. This is an impact on the prey species for tigers and other carnivores in the region, potentially. And then, you know, Matisse is our host here, so he knows more about this than everyone else. But living in the United States now, you sort of think someone has learned something about spillover and how to monitor and how to report and so on. But what we're seeing in the United States with spillover and spill back into the cattle production facilities, the avian influenza, is just mind-boggling, right? I think it was yesterday was the first time I read that. I think it's Wisconsin. For the first time said, well, we need to start doing serosurveys of people on farms to see how widespread this is a problem. That's, I think we're 3 or 4 months in now, 3 months at least, if not 4 months in, to the first recognition that the virus had spilled over into cattle, right? So we haven't learned too much yet. I'm sure we'll discuss that afterwards. Yeah, the pigs, we'll get there. We of course also continue working directly on diseases that impact wildlife, either directly, be that chytrid or white nose, and then of course the impact of avian influenza on marine mammals, but also on many of the bird populations we work for, where we see massive die-offs, of course, as well. And here it's also a question of, we're not going to stop a virus that has basically become endemic in many parts of the world, but what we can do is help create that resilient landscape that allows the recovery of these populations. So we talked about the interphases, and then the other thing we sort of focus on is the behaviors and practices and the policies that define these interphases. And obviously, I'm going to bring some egregious examples as far as I'm concerned, but this is a wide area. If you think about this little cartoon, basically, I have here this sort of infographic thing. This spillover potential for an infectious agent, right? That's actually really tough. And again, borrowing from Reina's publication from 2017, where she basically adapted this Swiss cheese sort of model. There's a lot of barriers that stop viruses spilling over from, let's say, a red duiker into a human, and then onwards from human to human. That is difficult, thankfully. But there are certain things that we do as humans which inherently, or which really reduce these barriers. And I always want to point out that the picture on the right is not some historic photo. This is from a colleague of mine from a large market in Indonesia, and it's only a few weeks old, right? And if you can look closely, you can see civets and monkeys and ducks and chickens and God knows what else. And this is a market where you have tens of thousands of people that visit as well, right? So let's not forget that. This is ongoing. And these kind of actions, what you're doing, you've removed most of these barriers, right? And we often, I think one thing that's also important for me, at least, to consider is that we're not only providing these interfaces for spillovers to facilitate spillovers, but we're also providing new interfaces, new evolutionary interfaces. Normally, you don't have a goose being pooped on by a pangolin and then sharing that with a monkey that's sitting next door, right? That really rarely would happen in a natural setting, especially if these animals are coming from different parts of the world, as they do in some cases. So these live animal markets really allow for fantastic recombination, reassortment, and other events to occur that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And it's a question of scale and density of human populations around those markets that is essential. These are just an old, not an old paper, but I think 2020 or something, where we just looked at bamboo rats moving along the trade value chain from the field where they're caught into the restaurant. And you just see this massive increase of shared coronaviruses as these animals progress to the kitchen, basically, where they're then slaughtered, right? Once they're slaughtered and prepared as nicely as they are below there, that's absolutely fine, right? It's completely cooked. It looks delicious. But the cook had to kill them, and there's blood and exposure and so on and so forth. And this, it's not an individual thing. This is going on tens of thousands of times every day. I want to also just point out that it's not only about the tropics, though it's mostly about tropical areas of the world. But we have also worked, and we still continue to work a lot in the Arctic and the boreal areas, where, for example, Native Alaskans and First Nations are absolutely dependent on what they call country foods, so wild meat and access to fish and marine mammals and so on and so forth. And here, it is also important as health professionals that we support these communities, especially in times when there's heightened worry due to climate change, to warming, to permafrost melting, and so on and so forth. So it's not only tropics, but anywhere else where communities are dependent on nature's food. So one of the things that, and this would be a talk on its own, basically, and you've over the years you've heard many colleagues speaking about this, that integrating or wildlife health is poorly, and that's actually exaggerated, is practically never integrated into a broader health system, into a health diagnostics or public health, a broad holistic public health surveillance system. So we spent a lot, and we continue to spend significant effort in developing the systems to integrate wildlife health from the front lines, basically, into public health monitoring systems. And we work a lot with governments on that. And there's a big, big need for that. And I will talk about policy, but I'll just sort of jump ahead a little bit. In the ongoing, initially failed, but now continuing ongoing negotiations for the pandemic treaty, this INB process, this is an integral part that's also been quite controversial, but it is clearly outlined in 2 paragraphs in the treaty that integrating wildlife into monitoring efforts within the national remits is going to be coming, and that's just one of the places where it's going to be in law, basically. So that's been a lot of our work, and you feel free to reach out to us on some of these tools that we have. We've adapted really simple frontline tools which are already in place in more than 1,400 to 1,500 locations around the planet, and adapted that for health. There's a lot of capacity out there already, which just needs to be it needs to integrate the health component to that. So we do quite a lot of that. These kind of community-based, community or ranger, we use a lot of our wildlife rangers or eco guards or whatever they're called in different parts of the world, these frontline workers and conservationists, to help us detect diseases very early on. And that's helped us, we were the first to detect African swine fever across, I think, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, because the communities started reporting that pigs were dying. It's a problem, by the way, because an NGO working in a country with a reportable, international, notifiable disease, and you're the first one to find it, you can't just go on Twitter and post that you've found ASF in a country, right? So it's a tricky place to navigate as well. But I think we can discuss that. But these systems we have in place, we've been doing this for over 25 years now for Ebola, early detection in the Republic of Congo. And that's been used now also for detection of clade 1 Mpox, because it's the same communities, unfortunately, which are being impacted. So with that, I'll talk about policies. So those of you who've known me longer know that I was lucky enough to start my career I always like to call it in the cowboy days, where we didn't know much. We go out and do things, and it was great. Yeah, it was a lovely, it was like no mobile phones, no internet, no things. You could be gone for weeks on end, putting collars on something, and it was fine. I do have to recognize, though, that if I want to change and make peace with nature, as the title of this thing is, I do have to work and engage with policymakers and decision makers. That is how things change, unfortunately. But this is really efficient if you have the structure in place to engage in these things. And the window of opportunity has shifted massively. So we have this recognition on broad spectrum that the role that the environment is important for health for all. The best is if coming out of one of our projects or our activities with our partners in a country, that translates to national legislation, as in this case in Laos, where the wildlife health surveillance has been adopted into national legislation and integrated. That is honestly very rare that actually happens. Sometimes it happens by pure haphazardly, that there's the right person in the right room and who takes a shine to wildlife health and says, I'm going to push this through in parliament or whatever. More successful and more you can plan and lobby and working in the large multinational or international agreements, such as the climate COP, climate negotiations, but also in the CBD, in the biodiversity COPs. and to make sure that health is integrated, that there's a One Health aspect in these documents and so on. And at the moment, we spent the last year and a half probably working with the at the I&D process for drafting this pandemic agreement on prevention, preparedness, and response to the pandemic threats. And as you know, that failed in the first 2 years and didn't actually get adopted at the World Health Assembly in May of this year, but it has now been restarted or has been prolonged. And there's another 11 months to go now to get this across. And I'm happy to talk about that if anyone's interested. But there's a lot of work to be done here. Pushing it. And, you know, the core issue that we push here is this foundational importance of nature and the primary prevention, be it of zoonotic pandemics, be it of biodiversity loss, and so on and so forth. And it just economically makes so much sense, right? I'm going to jump over this quite quickly. In the background is, you know, is the research, the wildlife research on diseases, on, you know, social sciences, on behaviors, and so on and so forth. But just in view of the time, and I don't want to cut into our discussion point, maybe just on this one of the interesting things I've discovered in my job here is now working with my colleagues who are experts in other fields like counter wildlife trafficking. And there are times when we can really work together across sectors and come up with sort of value added outputs, which wouldn't have been possible or is very difficult in a purely academic settings where the silos seem to be sometimes even stronger. Capacity building is key to that, so research, but then also capacity bridging, capacity building, making sure that, you know, the next generation is local, national, and are capable and have the resources they need to take over from us. So basically making ourselves redundant. And we're pretty good at that. So I think that's good. Now, I talked about our theory of change and everything, and you might have noticed there's something missing. And that's the famous elephant in the room. And I want to put that out there because I want to hear what you think about it and how far do health professionals have to deal with this. And the elephant in the room is capital, right? So we, you know, people say we live in the Anthropocene, and so I'm not a great fan of that. It sort of always implies everyone is responsible. Everyone's responsible. In a way, we're all responsible. But the fact if I use a straw or I use a plastic bag to go shopping is pigeons. That's just, as you would say in Berlin or something, it's pille-palle. It makes no sense, right? If at the same time, large corporations, fossil fuel production is ongoing and so on. So I think this is something which conservation organizations and others, many organizations have trouble addressing. And that is the central issue that all our problems are driven by a growth-based economic model in a world with finite resources, of course. And nature is cheap. We discount the future. And basically, I like this term of that, we're colonizing the future, basically. So while we have all these highfalutin discussions about decolonizing and important discussions, but decolonizing conservation and so on, at the same time, we are already colonizing the future. So that's something I think I find, at least at this stage of my career now, has become central to everything I do. And I always like to use this one just to sort of prod. As you can imagine, this doesn't go over well with, and it doesn't go over well with many audiences, depending where you are in the world, right? But it's something to consider. And then I added this has become, I think this is the biggest threat facing us in science, and democracies around the world, and that's misinformation. and even more so disinformation. And that obviously paired with the reach and speed of social media is something I have no idea how we're going to deal with that at this point in time. But it's something we probably need to talk about as well. If we want to make peace with nature, we're going to have to do something. I wanted to finish with these two slides. One of them is also that, you know, a human rights-based approach to health is also central, and we really need to keep that in mind. And then I'm just going to jump over this because I said it, and I just want to finish with this. Remember, when you talk about health, I feel strongly about this. First of all, health is a human right. It's a global common good. It's an asset and not only a cost. Normally, when you read about health in the paper, it's the government bemoaning that the NIH or that the NHS or whatever is costing more money and blah, blah, blah. Imagine a world where everyone's sick and the costs of that, right? That doesn't seem to get talked about a lot. Health is an asset, be it the health of humans, the health of animals, the health of livestock, and the health of wildlife, of course. We do have a clear intergenerational responsibility. When we talk about forever chemicals, we are colonizing the future, antimicrobial resistance, and so on and so on. And then the final one, it's at the bottom of the list, not because it's not important, but it's one of these that's so hard to achieve. And that is, you know, if we want to make peace with nature, then we do have to consider some interspecies health equity. And that's really hard. And, you know, I'm happy to hear any ideas you have as we move forwards. So thanks very much for that. And I'm going to stop sharing this. There we go. So I'm happy to discuss anything and all.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris, for this great talk and this great overview. You raised a lot of issues. You raised a lot of difficulties in how we can improve wildlife health in the context of One Health. So what are the solutions to that? And maybe to get very practical, one of the issues that you've been dealing with for a long time is wildlife trade. And we've just come out of a COVID-19 pandemic. We're still dealing with it quite a bit. There's still a lot of people who are suffering from long COVID. Yet you show a picture where people are still trading animals in a way that really is conducive to COVID-24 or COVID-25. So what do you think with that problem is the biggest barrier for improvement?
Yeah, I think that's probably one where we are making slowly, but we're really making the most progress, right? It's not like a wicked problem, not too wicked at least. It's really actually quite simple, right? Live animals, mammals and birds in large urban centers with large human population is a bad idea just because of the opportunities, as you point out. As you know, China banned the trade of wildlife for consumption in March 2020, and that ban has been pretty solid, right? It's a little bit of the trade, of course, is moved underground into the illegal, but it would never. You have to always think the transactional costs of dealing illegally with wildlife reduces the volume by orders of magnitude. And most of the species that are really that worry us, you know, I'm always reluctant to talk about high risk and low risk species, because then you get a squirrel that kills someone with coronavirus kind of thing. But most of that trade was actually perfectly legal, right? There is practically no restrictions on trade in bats in those areas where it happens. There's no restriction on the rodent consumption, as most of these animals are neither conservation threats or anything. So the best, of course, in a government like in China, you can close it down in 1 week, right? And you compensate and that's it. In some countries, we have seen shifts that parts of the trade have been reduced. So it's often focused on bats, right? You can't trade in bats, you can't trade in pangolins, and so on and so forth. And enforcement has gotten better. There are countries where nothing has happened. There are parts of the world, North Sulawesi, we know there's Nipah circulating everywhere. And one of the, what is it called? Extreme foods eating is the main tourist attraction, which is going to eat bats, right? So it takes small steps, but I am seeing legislation, the international agreements coming along, which are going to, once they're agreed and ratified, then countries are going to need to up their game on these interfaces, right? And there's a real difference in different parts of the world. I won't belabor this too long, but the real point is the live wildlife markets. If you kill it and smoke it, the person who killed it and that community is definitely at risk. We know that, right? But that smoked meat that's being moved is more or less, it's a threat through its contaminants, right? It's probably contaminated with formaldehyde and with arsenic and whatever else they've used to preserve it to get it to the market. That's one aspect. The other aspect is, I think we're, like in COVID, it's so difficult to understand what exponential growth was. I think most people many people underestimate how quickly the world has changed. And so practices which were okay 50 years ago or 30 years ago are now happening in cities of 25 million people with no infrastructure. And I think that's where we really need to be really aware of those areas. But I don't have the total solution, of course.
But your response is very positive. You're saying that actually, with regards to wildlife trade and the risk of disease, and perhaps also the problem of wildlife trade as a cause of biodiversity loss, there is progress being made in some countries, and maybe it will continue in other countries as well. So that's good news, which is nice to have also. Yeah.
I want to say that I'm generally very optimistic, right? It's just a question of, do we have enough time, right? I think we're seeing this shift, this famous Overton window of opportunity is completely shifted. We are now talking about things. Honestly, if I'd walked into a room 5 years ago in the German government and said, look, we need a holistic approach to this, they would have just fallen over laughing, right? And they would have thrown me out. Now they're listening, right? Like, I know you have exactly the same experience, and I know others on the call here have the same. We are talking about things which are unthinkable a few years ago. We can actually go in and say, growth-based economy in a finite environment, it's not going to work, is it? And people go, yeah, you're right. And then the Minister of Finance will be there and they'll say, well, yes, but we need to keep going, all right?
Yeah, no, that's true. So that's good news. Okay, Lineke, are there any questions from the chat?
Yes. So there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I think we have quite some time for discussion. So I will just pick one, but I think we can cover them all. So thank you for the inspiring talk, Chris. I think everyone really is inspired. And one of the questions that came up is, how do you think about rehabilitation centers? Do you think that is another thing that we should, with all these changes that are happening so fast, should be looked at and discussed in a different, is it a risk?
That's a good one. This is, I got to look at the participants quickly to see what I'm learning now. I'm just joking. So
It was Julia Alkema.
no, it doesn't matter. It's perfect. I have a difficult position with rehabilitation centers for many reasons. There is definitely excellent work being done by extremely dedicated individuals and organizations, rehabilitation centers. And we have seen some amazing work. And I'm just thinking of Asiatic black bear and gallbladder work and so on, and completely changed that market and changed the way those bears were impacted. And obviously, I actually come from a welfare background. I have a specialization in welfare back in the dark ages when I did that. And I feel strongly for that. I have a problem. Let me put it this way. Obviously, is an opportunity like a wildlife market for new interface. That's one thing. And there's very little monitoring going on and in these areas. The other is there's a lot of rehabilitation centers which are not well monitored. There's no framing for them and so on. And I think it's the same as the zoo community. You have AZA, YAZA zoos, but then you have a whole bunch of other backyard operations going on all over the world. And I think we have to hold those apart as well. So while there is good work being done, and some of it extremely important because they do sometimes deal with highly endangered species as well, obviously, and that could be quite important. On the other hand, I think there is a lot of work to be done on thinking carefully about where we put resources and how much resources we put into certain species which are not a conservation concern. And I know this is where we get into the values discussion, right? And the older you get in this job, the more it's all about values. And I regret that I didn't study philosophy every single day I get up, because I'm often at a loss of coming up with a good argument for either euthanasia or keeping something alive and so on and so forth. But I think that's something we need to really think about carefully.
So do you think when this the global shift towards more taking nature more as an important thing and more connected to human health, do you think it would increase the chances of getting funding for projects that are focusing on diseases that are purely of an wildlife health issue? How do you see that?
So the interesting thing is there are extraordinary amounts of money out there circulating around. There are even larger amounts of money which have been promised and which have no one really knows where they've gone, I think. But if you start thinking about things like the pandemic fund at the moment, we are talking about billions of dollars that will be dispersed to address infectious diseases, particularly, of course, zoonotic, with those with zoonotic potential. Will there be more money to look at diseases of wildlife per se? Probably not. I can actually see now I think some of the estimates are in the European Union after the last election that we're probably going to go through a cycle with a bit less funding for the environment and disease and health possibly. So I think there is a cycle. I don't really see a massive increase on wildlife health per se. There will always be research funding for that. I wouldn't think that's going to increase. Anything related to sort of monitoring systems, disease surveillance, pandemic and epidemic prevention, that has increased, and I think will stay at a high level in view of the fact that we now have, a global episodic of avian influenza, and we have an increase of mpox at the moment, and so on and so forth. So I think that will remain priority. The question is access to these funds. Many of these funds will be going to multilateral institutions. As you know, there's the quadripartite which will be picking up a lot of those funds, and so on. So I think for you as an individual, that might be difficult. And I also always want to highlight that if you're a wildlife health professional from the global north, you should be doing everything to make sure that health professionals in the global south attain the capacity and the resource they need to take care of the wildlife in the areas where they live. So those things that were pretty normal 25 years ago have really shifted. We practically always work with our colleagues in the country and provide maybe some technical explore. You know, sometimes you're doing something very niche, no one's done it before, but you're basically transferring that to the national staff always. And I know some of the others who are on the call here could comment on that as well, because so I think that's something to think about when you're a wildlife health professional in the global north. You do really need to think what is your expertise? How can you contribute best? And that's probably not by going somewhere and doing something.
Okay, thank you very much. So we should get into collaborations and try to get the specific wildlife health issues in the bigger collaborations, and then also take along the global south. Okay.
Absolutely. I think if I may just sort of add to that, when they talk about landscape level projects, we have these legacy landscapes where landscapes are funded in perpetuity to conserve them. One of the aspects that they always neglect, and up to now, is the health aspect and the health benefits from preserving that landscape. That is really being neglected. So, if you want to ask me about the most frustrating part of like running against the wall all the time, is to think, you know what? It's really good that it sequesters carbon, and it's really great that it keeps biodiversity, and but let's think about the health benefits and how much are the health benefits. So developing a metric, for example, this is one of our big goals, right? To have this sort of universal metric for each plot of land. This is the carbon benefits, these are the biodiversity benefits, and these are the health benefits, and hopefully some equity benefits as well, and so on. So just to put it in there, that's something really to get engaged in, also in the research behind that. How can we measure this benefit? I think, there's two tracks. Sorry, I'm going to ramble on about this. So I think there's two tracks. One is a revolution, where we change the economic system. Would be nice. I don't think it's going to happen. The other way is we're going to have to spend at least my lifetime still trying to turn this economic theory that we're based on now to include some of the things that are important for us. And I use us as a community here on this call.
Yeah, I really like that. I think we don't have a good solution to measure values, like other values than economic values. And if we don't fix that, we cannot start a discussion on what kind of decisions we should make for the greater good. Yeah. So on this, maybe to discuss more, there's a question from Miriam Maas. She's asking, there's a lot of or increasing attention for planetary health. And how do you feel what the role is of wildlife health in planetary health? And how does it differ from our role in One Health?
Yeah, so planetary health, eco-health, and they're different systems-based approaches to health. I'm pretty agnostic about the framing. I think the idea is you need to understand that you have some kind of systems-based approach, looking at the systems and the interrelationships and dependencies and so on. The big difference between planetary health and the One Health approach is that planetary health is a clearly and strongly anthropocentric approach. Human health is absolute at the center and remains at the center always. There are no attempts even to think about interspecies equity, things like that. And the environment is seen as a supporting factor for human health. The environment per se doesn't play a role. So for me personally, and the organization I work for, a planetary health framing would not work because it's not holistic enough. I think the closest to a One Health approach are, of course, some of the indigenous cosmologies and thoughts and traditional knowledge systems, which actually embrace what we would say is a very holistic One Health approach. That's actually the closest. And I think a lot of the One Health thought comes now in working and learning and listening to indigenous communities and trying to integrate some of the and understand some of the cosmology there. Planetary Health is doing fantastic work, of course. Yeah, their environment though is often more the public health environment. It's not that ecosystem, so to say. That's the way we understand it. There will be a document coming out pretty soon that sort of clarifies that on the European scale. There's been some really smart people been working on that in the last I think in the last year and a half. They've been working on this guiding document for the EU for the Commission. So we'll see, and they clearly differentiate that as well. We need both, right? Don't. I'm not trying to trash it or anything. It's just where we come from an environmental wildlife side. Planetary health just doesn't fit as well.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a question from Ruth Cromie about policymakers and getting policymakers enthusiastic to act. Those you described in your talk, but sometimes it's like it feels like a coincidence that there's someone at the right time at the right place, and those people can make a really important change. So Ruth is thinking, how can you market that, or how could you make sure that there's someone like that at the right location, at the right time, in the right position?
Well, first of all, I think Ruth has a lot more experience with me being successful in getting policymakers to do what she thinks is and what she thinks important. So she's, has a long and distinguished career in doing that. Now, for many, one of the biggest problems I've faced over the years, and that's even before I moved to WCS and some of the other projects I was doing I was doing a lot more work like ecological connectivity, renewable energy and ecological connectivity. Sorry, I see the chat pop up as well. Is this what they call the empty? That was me. I'm sorry. I don't know how to stop that happening. I'm not that enthusiastic. Is this what they call the empty chair syndrome, right? So you invite all your partners to the various meetings, and you really want to listen to them, and you want to engage and co-develop solutions, but they don't turn up. And so this is, and often it's, some of these things are super simple. You have a €4 million project. You are working on a local scale in the Alps. You need the head of the environment department and the head of whatever other department to turn up at your meeting. They're government employees. Your meeting's on a Thursday, and they can't get off from work to come to your meeting. They just don't get the permission to come. And that's really crazy, right? So that's at one level where you really run into problems that you need to find the right method to engage with your mostly government agency partners. On let's say a higher level, in the international agreement level and so on, it's a question of understanding the process. You need to know how decisions are made and who the players are and how to lobby them and build coalitions so that when that thing is going to be voted on, they all put their hand up. And that's like a war of attrition. You just got to keep doing it. You just can't be too. So and one of the problems on that, and I'm sure others have the same problem, is we spend an inordinate amount of time doing that. Phoning, being in meetings, talking, getting up, saying, blah, blah, blah. It's very difficult to measure. So at the end of the year, when they, we have to negotiate our budget internally, they say, well, so what are you guys doing last year? Oh, well, we spent 4 weeks sitting in a room in Geneva where we try to ambush the poor negotiators and try to tell them what to say when they go back into the room, that kind of stuff. So this attribution of effort to the outcome is very difficult, right? So that's a problem for us as an organization, or us within an organization.
So I really like that idea, and I recognize it a little bit from my own experience that you really need to understand how decisions are being made, and that it takes a lot of time to do so. Do you think it would be possible or beneficial if that, for example, would become a standard class into education of wildlife health researchers, or would it be? Do you think that something like that could be a solution to that? And maybe Ruth can also share her experience and her view on her own question. I think it's open to discussion for everyone.
Yeah, so I think honestly, I've been involved a little bit thinking about curriculum. I just recently gave up by sort of leading the conservation medicine curriculum in Vienna. And I'm kind of worried about where it might go, because I think it's still too much. There's only so many hours in your veterinary medical education, since there are only so many ECTS points to be given out. And a lot of them are used probably not for the best in view of the complex multidisciplinary and transsectoral problems we need to solve moving forwards, all right? And so rethinking these curriculums and translating science for decision makers and policymakers is like really, really important. It's important that we publish in Nature, but it's equally important that we make a summary of that paper. And by the way, that's not me, right? I wish I was doing this every day. It's not happening. Matisse, I'm sure, is doing this every day, but not me. But you publish in Nature, it's great, right? That's good. But you need to translate that, and you need to make sure that it's accessible to those decision and policy makers. And that's not being taught, right? I remember my boss in academia telling me, you're a researcher, we don't get involved in politics. Don't take a position on this, which ultimately led me to leave the University of Veterinary Medicine, basically, because you can't be paid by tax dollars and then not have an opinion and talk about it, right? So I think we do need to educate students and also postgraduates on how to do this and how to engage. Someone has to do that.
So Ruth, would you like to add anything to that? Also fine if you don't feel obliged.
That serves me right, doesn't it, for posing the question? So, but thank you. I think, maybe in terms of curriculums, actually, before I say that, thank you so much, Chris. This has been such an interesting discussion already. So yeah, really best of 2024 so far. Yeah, in terms of maybe, having that in the curriculum or just for all of us, there is something about us really needing to understand that theory of change of exactly who, and it's almost like, who do you want to do what, and doing something in that kind of power mapping of who are those individuals that you're going to need to get to do something, who do you have to kind of lure in, and maybe maybe these things that these are things that should be taught, and then there are bound to be those individuals who are really good at that kind of relationship management. And actually, as Chris says, they are things which you don't get any bonus points at the end of the year, do you, for having had a good relationship with somebody? You're just it's just about your sort of publications or something. But it is so key, because it's at the interfaces between you've got your science over there or this or that, and if it is not communicated between, or even if you write that guidance that should help them, but if that guidance then isn't put into practice and so on, then then it's wasted as well. So it's all those bits that go between, and probably there is room for some sort of training in that as well. So yeah, but we all need to be much better at it. That's what really was why I was asking the question. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe it's something we can take along for a next workshop or something. There's another
Could
question
I
from.
could I
Yep.
just point something out, because Ruth sort of pointed it out as if everyone knows this, and there's something I really didn't realize, is how much time and how much policy and legislation is actually written by organizations like ourselves or Ruth and others, or as an individual, you're pulled in by a government or an agency to actually write the entire thing, right? That's something is extraordinary, right? If you're not in that world, you think someone in parliament is writing this, or the aides to some politician or senators writing. That's not the way it works. They actually come to you and say, we need help to write this. And then the way it works in the US, I mean, just in the US, right? So you'll be approached, let's say, by the Democrats, right? To talk about something environment. So you write this thing, you're full of it, and it's great, and it's wonderful. And then it's negotiated, right? And so everything you wrote is reduced to some skeletal remnant, which they think they may at some stage actually get through Parliament or Congress in this case. So depending where you work, nothing gets through Congress, so it doesn't really matter what you do. But you have to engage because of these relationships. There will be another term coming up and so on. And the same works in the EU, exactly the same, right? And I mean, I know Ruth has done this a lot, but I was quite blown away how much time I spent, especially the first years of the pandemic, actually writing texts and getting them through and then arguing for them and everything. And you can't put that on your publication list, by the way. I helped draft this. I spent 3 weeks or 5 weeks writing this thing. Yeah.
Ruth, go ahead.
Can I respond to that? Thank you. Because I completely agree that, there's a kind of an expertise then that writes these things for these international treaties or whatever. And so you think, well, that's good. The governments have signed up for this. That's a win. But actually, if you don't have then the NGO communities and wider society absolutely pushing them either to do it themselves, or better still saying, listen, I know you've signed up for this, we can deliver it, just give us a bit of cash or whatever, and we will do it for you. I think, without the NGO community and sort of wider society, I think we would all be doomed. So I think it's a case of really just using those treaties or whatever it is in the best way, and then really helping governments then to respond to it. But, I'm still always looking to try to get some of the people in government to actually be really motivated to do something themselves. And I think it's how we turn some of them into real advocates is our big challenge, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, we might have to learn some social sciences for that as well. So I would like to continue the discussion with a question from May, talking about treaties. This is regarding the pandemic treaty. What do you think? How good are the chances that One Health principles will be part of the treaty? At the moment, the whole paragraph on One Health is far from reaching consent, and also the countries of the global south see One Health as a concept coming from the global north, and they are not afraid it's not equitable. Yeah, how do you think about this?
So, we could have a whole 2 hours about this. So there's a few aspects to this One Health thing. So first of all, we have to recognize the leaders in One Health, national One Health strategies are all from the global south and practically all from Africa, right? So if you look at the national strategies that are out there, they come from Africa, basically, the publicly available ones. I have to point out the Netherlands has a really, really, really good one, but they didn't call it a One Health strategy. They call it the zoonotics, what is it called? Zoonotic spillover. And that's a fantastic document, right? That's really, really good. Congrats on that. But so that sort of falls out, but everything else from the global south. If you look at the new document from the Zambian one, is quite recent, 6 months old. It's a really, really good document, right? And they're on it. They've hired people and so on and so forth. Rwanda has now published the second one, right? They had one that they published in 2016. They had the pandemic, and the Minister of Health said, ooh, this didn't work so well, right? And they actually gone back and rewritten and come up with a new one. So this is quite a dynamic process. The problem in the pandemic, negotiations, first of all, there's a process problem. The way that the negotiations were carried out, just the sheer process, there was no space for people to meet in a room and say, this is the red line for me. or for our block, right? It's always a blocks. So that never happened. So it was always discussed in plenum, right? And that's weird. That never works well. And I think everyone has agreed that that's one of the main problems as a process oriented. And then very quickly, the Global South, and absolutely justified, recognized, oh, the Global North really wants One Health. The EU was pushing, we want to have One Health and blah, 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 and so on. So it just became a negotiation pawn. It's not like, I don't think anyone in the Global South does not appreciate that to stop zoonotic spillover, you need that One Health approach and you need surveillance of wildlife. But there are certain actors that are very vocal that have been using that as a massive pawn in the equity discussion, right? If it could have been something else, but because the EU and others were pushing so hard initially in the first few months for this One Health, that has become a major pawn. So this is, I think, the key as we move in these next 11 months to make sure that that doesn't get misused as a pawn. Just imagine a pandemic agreement that doesn't have One Health. That just is like complete idiot. I mean, that would be completely idiotic, right? We're not going to look at wildlife at all or the environment. So I think I'm not too worried that it will disappear. I think the Articles 4 and 5, as they are now, are pretty good and should probably stay in there. They're quite basic. Question is, will there be a One Health additional tool or something out there as a second platform? I don't know yet. We'll see how it goes. There are a lot of equity issues to be resolved, and those are mostly related to transfer of technology, access to so the whole pathogen access and benefit sharing issues, the PAPs, that's also been tied into One Health. That needs to be resolved, right? And if you look, this is one of the things which is so extraordinary. While in the last weeks of negotiating the pandemic agreement, we get an outbreak or we get a spillover of avian flu into cattle in the United States.
Yeah.
And it is only a Twitter storm of 15 or 20 individuals who are going out there saying, USDA, it's been 3 weeks. Where are the sequences? What is it? I think it was 6 weeks before they released a sequence. At the same time, they're sitting in Geneva and going to the Global South and say, we need you to share sequences. And of course, we're not going to share the benefits. Nah, we'll give you 5% of the vaccine we're going to develop or something. I'm making this up right now, but that's how the discussion was going. So I can actually imagine that this avian flu situation in cattle in the Global North can help us in the negotiations moving forward. It's going to be up to civil society to bring that on the table every single day and say, if you can't do it, you can't ask for it from the Global South. And then the final one on that is there was no agreement on how this was going to be funded. All right. So there were a lot of responsibilities which were not defined because no one wanted to define them, but there was no funding. There wasn't even reflections on the funding on how this was going to be paid for. So I think those are sort of the main, if I summarize it.
Yeah, so aside from learning how decisions are made, it's also good to get a good overview of who's responsible for what, so you see the gaps in advance and try to fill them before there's a breakout or an outbreak. Yeah. So I would like to continue the discussion to a slightly different topic. It's a question from Mohsin Masood. I will change it a little bit. I will rephrase it a little bit. It's a question that I also frequently have. I'm also working with bats. So the question is about bats being the source of all evil. At least it's if you talk about wildlife as a source in general, as a source of potentially pandemic viruses, how do you prevent people from actually harming them or decreasing the willingness of people to conserve them? What is the best way to find a balance between letting people understand what kind of behavior needs to be stopped to get a pandemic spillover while still continue to make people love the animals, the wildlife, and protect them?
Yeah, I think, this is one of these conundrums that we face, that we're often, and I blame myself as well. We should, every time we talk about bats or wildlife per se, is we should start out with a 5-minute disclaimer about all the functions that wildlife, the essential functions, right? A life on the planet without bats is basically not possible, right? It's just not going to happen. It's not possible. So that's those ecosystem services that bats provide, beyond all the awe and beauty inherent to them, is something we need to always point out. Now, the interesting thing is, while this comes up a lot, we don't actually see much persecution of bats on any large scale. Yes, every now and then during the pandemic, someone set fire to a cave or something like that. It's really, really rare, right? It's not like we've seen much persecution of wildlife at all. I think what we need to do is, first of all, we need to always point out there are a lot of bats. That's already the first thing, right? There are a lot of bats. They have a few, there's all this discussion, and I'm certainly not the expert about the immune function in bats and why can they harbor so many viruses. But one of the easiest things is there are a lot of bat species, and I've lost count of 1,432 or something like that now. I don't know, it keeps changing, but it's in those orders. There's rodents, and there's bats. There's a lot of them. They have a lot of viruses. And then the other thing is they fly around, right? So they get around, and they live in colonies, most of these bats. So they're great for evolving novel viruses, right? So I think we just have to always make clear that it's not inherent that bats are in any way, certainly not responsible in any way. It's us incurring and modifying the landscapes in which bats have lived for eons. And I think we just need to be more careful and positive in our communications. And I'm certainly one who's today, yes, I was definitely delinquent on that. I should have started with how amazing and cool they are and everything. But I'm going to hope for an excuse that all of you on this call know how amazing and cool they are and that they're not bad. But you're right. It's something we need to be absolutely aware. But the fact of this persecution of wildlife is actually, thankfully, quite rare. It's really, we work in 60 countries, and even during the height of Corona, we haven't seen that. And some of the craziest stuff, if I'm thinking of avian flu, right? This is one of the things where we're also worried about persecution of wild birds, right? The craziest things I've seen has been from Finland and the Department of Agriculture from California, right? They put out, in the first day or something, they put out a notification on their webpage that a farmer should go around killing wild birds on their farms, right, to keep avian flu away. And I think the Finns, the Finnish government also had something similar, right? Kill all the birds around your ferrets breeding. Yeah. But the point is, it didn't actually get traction. The outrage was so quick and robust that, yeah.
So maybe not even persecution or killing, but also, so for the Netherlands, for example, now people are massively insulating their houses, which is very important for the climate change and being more sustainable with housing. But it's like the main niche or the main habitat of all of our bats, and these people actually use their knowledge of bats being potential hosts of zoonotic viruses to say as an additional argument, because they're not allowed to insulate their house if there's a bat colony there, to say, well, we don't want these bat colonies so near in our house. So it is a conflict. And we are continuously battling in how we communicate this, indeed, saying how valuable they are, but also teaching people more about bats makes them more likely to like them, as a way of trying to find a balance between researching even the bat-human interface, but also to protect them and continue people to be motivated to protect them, not even persecution, but just allowing a wildlife to be near them and not trying to keep them away.
So I just want to point out that, you know, I don't know if you interact with WCS, but WCS Canada, for example, that's a big issue for them, the insulation of houses and the roosting opportunities being decreased. And they have a large project using building these bat boxes, or whatever, what do you call it? Bat boxes and roosts and things like that all over the landscape, and all the education that goes with that. I think they, you know, I haven't followed it in detail, but I think they're quite successful with their education campaigns. But as you point out, it's tedious, right? It's little steps.
Thanks. Yeah, I will follow that up. Another question from Alex Greenwood. So we've been talking about policymakers and convincing policymakers. How about convincing the general public of the importance of living in peace with nature? How do you think, what's the best strategy, and what is our role as wildlife health researchers?
Yeah, she has a boyfriend already, right? Is that correct? Taylor Swift. So that's not a way to get in there anymore. That's too late. I was just thinking, yes, of course, if Taylor Swift said bats are cool and you got to protect nature, that would be amazing, right? I think it's part of our job as wildlife health professionals in academia and conservation organizations to actually spend a significant amount of time at, you know, there's certain stages in your career when you can afford to do that, to engage with the public in the sense of writing public opinion pieces, writing op-eds in newspapers. You know, we have so many cool, positive stories of recovery, of amazing colleagues doing the most amazing work in the field. We need to just share those. We need to always share positive and, you know, we need to provide a positive outlook. People, doom and gloom doesn't work, right? We try to tell them, you're going to die if you keep eating civets or whatever. It doesn't bother anyone, right? We have a project in Congo at the moment where they go out on an island once a year. These guys go out on an island, catch bats, and they literally bite the wings off on the live bats, right? And they go back into the urban center with the live bats. It's amazing if you see these photos. Of course, for them, it's not a problem. They're in the 10th generation bat hunter. They've got all the antibodies that they need. The uncles who didn't have them are long gone, but they are actually moving into cities, right? So, and any kind of education there doesn't seem to work. So I think we need to really have positive stories that we share and make the effort to tell good stories, right? That's it. And that unfortunately comes, here we see Coldplay is actually doing something for the, okay. The chat is getting interesting about which groups are doing it. This is what we need to do. Download more Coldplay. I think.
So Carolina, maybe you would like to share your thoughts. You mentioned something in the chat about how people should be involved. Do you have any concrete examples of what really worked for you?
She has no mic, she says. She has
no
microphone.
That's a pity. Okay. Well, she says, I will speak for her, that in her point of view, the population should be involved as much as possible. So to be really open about your research, to understand how these animals are important for nature. Programs of environmental educational are very important for that. Seen many projects reaching a good success and involvement of people through this strategy.
Absolutely agree. So, yeah. No, absolutely agree. We can always do more and we can do better. But you know, this comes sort of, I'm just watching the time. No one's gone down the rabbit hole of mis and disinformation. I'm actually surprised, right? Maybe it's the bubble I live in at the moment. It's just so overwhelmed by that. So education and involving the public has become extremely difficult because of rampant mis this mostly this information as well, which is circulating out there, and the way the media has shifted to monetizing each and every interaction with the media, right? We used to read news, but now we're driven to read certain news because that's the way these corporations monetize news. I think this is a really, really big problem. And that impacts us, of course, in the environment. Anyone who works in the climate or biodiversity sphere, but also in spillover COVID and so on, is impacted by that. So on the local level, we can often really well engage. On a global level, it's quite a battle, right? Because these, corporations are putting in hundreds, millions of dollars to make sure their information gets out there.
Yes, but maybe it is a good thing if each of us works on a good relationship on a local level with the public.
Sure,
and we
absolutely.
have advocates, or we have people vouching for the One Health, including environment and wildlife, then you still have a global coverage of the public, involving the public, at least those that are sensitive to the message.
Right, and there is some good legislation which has come out just recently. Canada has just this week or last week, decided on a new piece of legislation that stops greenwashing. So you have to, if you say that you have any kind of nature positive or climate positive effect, you need to demonstrate that. Well, I think the wording is with acceptable or recognized scientific methods, otherwise you can't. Well, they put that law out, I think, on Tuesday. On Wednesday, all the fossil fuel companies, the Canadian ones, removed everything about net zero,
Wow.
nature positive, everything's gone. All
that's
the
really negative, actually.
So there is legislation, and I am curious to see how this sector, the social media sector and sharing mis and disinformation is going to develop further, right? There seems to be, I think I see a little optimistic thing as people are just tiring of listening to this stuff all the time and reverting and going offline. So maybe that's it.
So there was another remark from Kata Seilen on this. I really like that idea that if you involve citizen science, or if you try to do a citizen science project, this is a good way to reach out to the public and spread the message. It's a different level of care for what we try to communicate. And Carolina adds about a Cyanocitatas pixie in Brazil. The only individual living in the wild was even being followed by people that would report when this individual was seen, and researchers could track it 24/7 and get a lot of data about the habits of this individual. So that, I think, is an example of involving the public and getting them enthusiastic about preserving nature.
Mm-hmm.
One more question from Rodrigo Novaes. In your opinion, what is the present and future role of veterinary medicine professionals that work with wildlife in One Health?
Well, I think, saying that your time has come is wrong. I think it started, a decade ago, where we really saw this huge increase of interest in environment and wildlife health. It was more niche, and it's sort of really become mainstream, I would say now. So this is the time to consider when you're in your, for those of you who are potentially still in your veterinary medical training, just make sure that you reach across sectors and try to get better informed. For those who are in, were students of mine in Vienna, I know I used to scare them because they came in the last year, and then I would always say, the first thing was, what theater did you see? What book did you read? I can't remember what the third thing was. It really scared them often because they were so focused on getting good grades and getting everything. They had no time, even though they were living in Vienna, right? You're like, come on, you're students, you need it. So I think one of the things we need to do is we need to expand, not only the curriculum, but also the mindset to reach out across sectors and be interested in the broader, just simply put, the broader going ons in the world. What drives the world, right? I was on a call yesterday. The price of gold has gone up. I don't know what it is, but it's gone up significantly. And my colleagues in Latin America see a massive increase in mercury disbursement into the rivers, right? Because it suddenly makes sense in even more locations to go looking for them. So if you don't follow those things, it doesn't help you being a wildlife professional, because by the time you react, your fish and communities are already even more contaminated than they already are. So I think being curious and engaging across sectors and being challenged and speaking out and being challenged. I say a lot of things, and then, I hope people come back to me and say, that was a load of bollocks. Here, you need to read this book. And I always remember a book that Thies was, and I'm sure you remember, was reading one day, and I was like, I need to make sure I read that. And I've become a big fan, right?
Piketty. And Capital in the 21st Century.
Yeah, exactly, right. And that's the thing. Reach out to mentors, reach out to your colleagues, sit down and have a talk. I think that's more important. That's something we need to do. Yeah, that's it. Your favorite book. We could do that we could share that in the sustainability group once. What are your one favorite book everyone should read?
Yeah, I think everyone can put theirs in the chat, and we have a nice list for ourselves and for Rodrigo to learn about the world's most important things. So I think
maybe I'll take over.
I covered all the questions. Yeah, thanks,
we still have 10 minutes to go. So one thing I was wondering, Chris, is that you've been talking a lot about actions, things we can do, and I think that's correct, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there's one thing that struck me in your title, and that is making peace with nature, which really sounds more like a change in the way that you think, rather than actual concrete actions. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how you would encourage a world view change from humans being apart from nature to humans being a part of nature, which makes sense with your title, Making Peace with Nature.
So, this is a really difficult one. I have to say, I struggle personally with this on a daily basis. It's difficult for me as an individual in the life I lead to make peace with nature. I just have to admit that the hypocrisy around the work I do and the impact I have it's really difficult to reconcile. So the point I'm trying to make is it is already difficult on an individual basis. I think it's on a community level. I live in the US, I live in the Bronx. That is definitely not an area which is really interested in the environment in any way. But working locally with the community where I live in and engaging and speaking up together with many others that are there, I think sets sort of these little seeds, and you do see change coming at a very local level. On the level of, on a global level, can I influence, or can we influence politicians or governments to think beyond the next term? The only way is voting, right? We all need to engage in democracy, and we need to vote, and use whatever other tools the society offers us. That's something that's clearly a tool that's there for us to engage in, and we need to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I wish
No,
I
that's fine. Yeah. So one of the things that you came back several times is about information. So you are in an NGO. There are people in universities that have maybe a slightly different relationship to information provision. So where NGOs can lobby, it's more difficult for a university scientist to do that, but you can be an honest broker. So you can try to provide information in an accessible way that reflects the situation as you understand it to your best knowledge. So I think that's very good. I've experienced it personally with this HiPath AI outbreak, where in the beginning, when people see it in their country, they're very quickly informed that this virus is coming from wild birds and that wild birds are the cause. I've made it a really strong effort through social media, as you've seen, to really inform people about what the actual history was of this HiPath AI outbreak, to such a degree, and I'm not the only person doing it, there are other people doing it too, that now when information comes out that this virus is coming from wild birds, there are other people, people of the general public, or people who are bird watchers and care about wild birds, that say, no, that's not the way it is. It's actually like this, and they provide the correct information. So actually providing correct information and making sure that there is a constant information flow with the correct information is very important for this. And I think it also addresses a little bit what you said about misinformation and disinformation, in that by providing people with the right data at the beginning, they are in a way immunized against misinformation, because then they think, well, that doesn't really make sense with what I learned. So I think that it could be really important for us, and I think it could be an important role that we play. And also as scientists who write scientific articles, I know that in the past I've written scientific articles where I thought, well, I've given the solution here, why don't they read it? But now I realize that besides writing that scientific article, you have to actually indeed translate it, and you have to bring it to the general public. You have to explain it to politicians, to administrators, so that you make it more actionable. So I think there are ways that are very well possible for many people in the wildlife health field to play an important role. Other things that I think two actions that that weren't mentioned until now, but I think could work, and there's several others. One is rights for nature. So there are, I think, something like 400 initiatives to actually give rights to rivers or lakes or seas. In the Netherlands, the Wadden Sea is now being considered to be an entity in itself that has rights. So that might be one way to go that is gaining traction. And something else that we're doing in the avian influenza field is to provide solid evidence for the failure of the current system. So I think that if you can show what the level of mortality is of, for example, HiPath AI in wildlife populations, actually documented in a peer-reviewed scientific document, then you can go back with that to government, to people who have to make policy decisions, and show what evidence it is for the system as it's going on now not functioning well. So having gone through this list, do you have any others that you come up with that you say, well, this is something that we really should also mention?
No, I think that's a pretty comprehensive list already. I like obviously this idea that we as scientists or as a wildlife health professional need to engage with the public on whatever stream or media constantly. That's really important. And I mean, you do a great job on that. And we need to push back, right? I think the only thing we have to always keep in mind is there's misinformation, is that you just get wrong information and share it and you think it's true. But disinformation is really sharing information you know is untrue and you're sharing it. And that's where, at least at the moment, you know, we've seen it in the United States with congressional hearings and so on certain aspects. Yeah. Where the science, no one's questioning science, it's just to make points, right? And I think that's something I'm a bit worried about moving forward. And I have to say, I'm sorry, but I need to jump off at 4 because I need to jump on another call. Okay. Very sorry.
And we're at the end, and I really wanted to stop here. There are more questions. Surprisingly, we've gone through this more than an hour of question time with lots more to discuss. So that's great. And that's thanks in great part to your wonderful presentation. We will be having webinars on this sustainability issue in the future, and we hope we can get as good a speaker as you. So thanks very much. Thank you everybody for participating and staying online for these 2 hours. Yeah, let's go for a sustainable future.
Absolutely. Right. Thanks everyone. And let's have that book list. I'm watching the books here. Please share the book list. Right. Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, Chris. Bye.
Bye. Thanks very much again.
Thank you.